Genshin Impact is a wondrous game with an ever-growing world, and stylish art design is able to capture the imagination of players. Whether you enjoy the world, story, gameplay, one aspect that keeps players coming back to the game are the amazing characters. So, I'm Darcblade with a character guide to Chongyun in Genshin Impact. In this guide we will briefly cover the basic lore of the character, their moves, abilities, weapon options, stat priorities, and artifact builds. Remember though that these guides are aimed at free-to-play and low-spender players, so the guides will feature characters as if they were Constellation level 0 with 4-star weaponry, with a few exceptions. Chongyun is a 4-star cryo character who wields a claymore. However, to obtain Chongyun, you have to either get him through the gacha system, he's also available sometimes in the item store, or in the past he has been available through rare one-off events. Chongyun hails from a long line of exorcists from Liyue, so he's continuing the family business, so to speak. However, Chongyun was born with an excessive amount of yang, which is translated to positive energy. This has made him very effective at being an exorcist, but at the same time, he has never seen a spirit for himself. Most of the time the spirits flee before Chongyun can actually lay eyes on them. This high amount of excessive positive energy has also made him susceptible to various forms of heat, especially when it comes to food, and strong emotions. If he does come into contact, it can lead to unexpected results, shall we say. His friends sometimes can play jokes on him because of this, but at the end of the day Chongyun is a dedicated exorcist devoted to improving his craft. Now every character in Genshin Impact has access to various talents, normally divided into combat talents and passive talents. Passive talents obviously are mechanics that work in the background of a character, whilst combat talents are the moves and abilities you actually perform with them. So first of all, let's talk about Chongyun's combat talents. First up are his normal attacks, also referred to as Demon Bane. When pressing the attack button, Chongyun can perform up to 4 consecutive attacks with his claymore. A side note, sometimes you will see icy particles shooting out of the final attack, but this is due to a constellation which we'll talk about later on in the video. Alternatively, you can hold down the attack button, which will perform a charged attack, which will drain stamina. With Chongyun, it will allow him to spin in circles, which the player can slightly control, move in the direction of the spinning attack, which will end with a final sweeping attack, knocking enemies back. And then finally, if you press the attack button while airborne, you'll perform a plunging attack, to which Chongyun will plummet towards the ground, hitting enemies in an AoE around the impact zone. For a claymore user, Chongyun's normal attacks are quite fast, but as a result they hit a little bit less than normal claymore users' attacks, which is the trade-off you pay, unfortunately. The next combat talent, which is Chongyun's elemental skill, is known as the Spirit Blade Chonghua's Layered Frost. When activated, Chongyun will flip into the air and plunge his greatsword down into the ground, creating an explosion of cryo damage. This hits quite hard, but more importantly, afterwards it will create a ring of frost indicated by a white outline. This frost field will then go on to enhance and infuse all sword users, claymore users, and polearm wielding characters with cryo damage, so their weapons will be infused and all their normal attacks will deal cryo damage upon hit, so long as they stay within the frost field. The infusion does remain a few seconds after a character does leave the field, but for constant application of the cryo infusion you have to remain in the field. So this means that even if you switch off of Chongyun to another character that uses a sword, greatsword or polearm, their normal attacks will be dealing cryo damage. There are a few exceptions to this. Certain characters who have their own infusions overwrite Chongyun's Layered Frost, so this is something to be aware of. At the end of the day though, the Layered Frost is a great way to apply constant elemental damage to a team party. Which brings us on to the third and final combat talent, which is the Spirit Blade Cloud Parting Star. This is Chongyun's elemental burst. When activated, Chongyun will summon 3 gigantic spirit blades in the air. These, after a short delay, will fall to the ground, one after another. Upon impact, they will explode, dealing AoE cryo damage and launching opponents. Now the blades don't all land at once, they'll land one after another, resulting in 3 separate hits. So this is something to be aware of, especially when you are creating elemental reactions. As hypothetically, say you're going for a melt elemental reaction, your enemy is already debuffed with the pyro element, you cast Chongyun's Cloud Parting Stars, only the first sword will trigger the melt reaction, the other 2 unfortunately will not. But regardless, this is a strong elemental burst for Chongyun and one of his pros in all honesty, as it has a low energy cost, a quick cooldown, and it still hits incredibly hard, making it a very useful skill for the young exorcist. But that brings us on to our passive talents. First up is Steady Breathing. This allows sword users, claymore users and polearm wielding characters that are within the frost field created by the Chongyun's Layered Frost to have their normal attack speed increased by 8%. This is very useful when it comes to certain characters that have fast attack speeds. The next passive talent is the Rime Chaser Blade. When the frost field created by your elemental skill disappears, another Spirit Blade will be summoned to strike nearby opponents, dealing 100% of Chongyun's Layered Frost skill damage as AoE cryo damage. Opponents hit by this blade will also have their cryo resistance decreased by 10% for 8 seconds. Now this skill is very useful, but it can be a little bit finicky, so to speak. Basically, you don't get to choose who the Rime Chaser Blade hits. So if you're facing multiple opponents, it could end up hitting someone you don't really want to focus on. But still, because this is an AoE damage, it should affect a fair amount of opponents so long as they're clumped up together. And on top of that, the fact that this reduces enemies' resistance to the cryo element makes it incredibly useful. Normally a rotation would be to use your elemental burst after the Rime Chaser Blade has actually hit an enemy, so your elemental burst will deal even more damage. And then the final passive talent is the Gallant Journey. When you're using Chongyun on an expedition in the Liyue area, the time consumed is reduced by 25%. So a nice little bonus for using Chongyun to get some extra materials whilst you're not playing the game. So there we have it, those are all the talents available to Chongyun. Some people may look at his moves and abilities and see the character as quite simple, but that being said, he is a very useful character, especially when it comes to certain team compositions. Thanks to his elemental skill, the Chongyun's Layered Frost, creating that frost field, it allows you to create very effective permafreeze teams. He can pretty much turn any character, so long as they're using a sword, claymore or polearm, into an additional cryo character for the team. That, coupled with the fact that he has a very useful damage dealing elemental burst, makes him a great addition to many teams in the game. But moving on to the next section, where we quickly talk about useful constellations with Chongyun. Now, like I said, most of the time these guides are aimed at free-to-play players and low spenders, so you may not have access to these constellations. But nonetheless, if you are able to get these certain ones with Chongyun, you can change things up a little bit, improving the character. First of all, at Constellation 1 is Ice Unleashed. When you perform Chongyun's normal attack combo, the last hit will release 3 icy blades directly in front of Chongyun. Each blade will deal 50% of Chongyun's attack as cryo damage to all opponents hitting this path. This obviously adds more damage to the combo, although you do have to perform the last hit of the combo, which can be time consuming, but regardless, this is a way for Chongyun to apply the cryo element to opponents, regardless of if you're in the frost field or not. The other constellation that's noteworthy is Constellation Level 2, Atmospheric Revolution. Basically, elemental skills and elemental bursts cast within the frost field, created by the Spirit Blades Chongyun's Layered Frost, have their cooldown time decreased by 15%. Rarely are there skills in Genshin Impact that actually reduce cooldown speeds of elemental skills and bursts, so this is definitely one that stands out. And then finally is Constellation Level 6 Rally of 4 Blades. When you cast your elemental burst, the Cloud Parting Star, it will deal 15% more damage to opponents hit with a lower percentage of their max HP remaining than Chongyun. So it allows your elemental burst to deal more damage to weaker opponents, but more importantly, this also will allow you to summon 1 more additional Spirit Blade when you cast your ultimate, so it will hit 4 times instead of just 3. So moving on to the next section, where we talk about the various builds that I like to use for Chongyun. Now the first and main way I use Chongyun is the sub DPS build. This means I'll be using Chongyun as a backup DPS character, whilst at the same time allowing him to deal decent damage, especially when it comes to his elemental burst. So first of all, when it comes to the weaponry, of course if you get 5-star weapons, these are going to be far superior most of the time when compared to 4-star weapons, but we are primarily looking at 4-star weapons here. So first of all, I'd recommend the Luxurious Sea Lord. This will give us a nice attack percentage buff. But on top of that, it will also give us the Oceanic Victory. This will increase the elemental burst damage by 24%. On top of that, when an elemental burst hits an opponent, there's a 100% chance of summoning a huge onrush of Tuna that will deal 200% attack as AoE damage. This can occur once every 15 seconds. But the Tuna attack aside, the attack increase of the weapon as well as the increase to our elemental burst is primarily why I would recommend this weapon. Failing that, if you don't have access to the Luxurious Sea Lord, you can also use the Prototype Archaic, which again gives us a nice attack increase, and on top of that you'll also get the Crush bonus, which on hit, your normal and charged attacks have a 50% chance of dealing an additional percentage attack damage to opponents within a small AoE. Again, this can only occur once every 15 seconds. And then finally, the last option I would recommend is the Sacrificial Greatsword if you're able to get it. This will give us a nice increase to our energy recharge, and on top of that we'll also have the Composed bonus, which after damaging an opponent with a elemental skill, that said skill has a percentage chance to end its own cooldown. This can only occur once every 30 seconds. And with Chongyun being able to cast his elemental skill twice in a row, doesn't create 2 fields, but instead it will immediately end the first field, allowing you to bring down that Spirit Blade, which debuffs opponents, making them take more cryo damage. But next on, moving to the artifacts. With this sub DPS build, I'd recommend going for 2 pieces of the Blizzard Straya set and 2 pieces of the Noblesse Oblige set. Of course, you'll have 1 piece spare to which you can fill in the gaps where needed. Now, the 2-piece Blizzard Straya set will give you an increase to your cryo damage of 15%, and for wearing 2 pieces of the Noblesse Oblige, you'll get your elemental burst damage increased by 20% as well. 2 straightforward buffs to Chongyun overall. But when it comes to the stats on them, when it comes to your sands, I'd recommend going for attack percentage. Failing that, you can also go for energy recharge. When it comes to your goblet, you'll want to go for cryo damage bonus, and then when it comes to your circlet, you'll want to go for crit rate or crit damage, depending on your substats. Speaking of substats, obviously crit rate and crit damage are king, followed by attack percentage and then energy recharge. As for your talent priority, with this build I'd recommend first maxing out your elemental burst, the Spirit Blade Cloud Parting Star. Afterwards go for the Spirit Blade Chonghua's Layered Frost, followed by your normal attacks. This build is great for Chongyun as it allows you to switch to him when your main DPS is on cooldown, apply that frost field as well as use your elemental burst if needed, perform a few normal attacks as well if so, and then he can be switched out. While he may not be on the field for long, this build definitely utilizes the positive aspects of Chongyun's character. Which brings us on to the next build, which is the Permafrost main DPS build. This build is for players who want to use Chongyun as their main DPS in their team. And whilst you can argue for days about what character is the best DPS, sometimes at the end of the day you want to use the characters that you personally have a connection with through appearance, personality, whatever. So, for the Permafrost main DPS build, when it comes to the weaponry, I'd recommend using, again, either the Luxurious Sea Lord or failing that, the Prototype Archaic. 2 simple weapon choices. Afterwards, when it comes to the artifacts, you'll want to go for the 4-piece Blizzard Straya set. Again, for wearing 2 pieces, we'll get that bonus to our cryo damage, and for wearing 4 pieces, when a character attacks an opponent affected by cryo, which should happen the majority of the time, thanks to the frost field pretty much infusing all our normal attacks with cryo, our crit rate will be increased by 20%. Additionally, if the opponent is completely frozen, the crit rate is increased by another additional 20%, giving us a bonus of 40% overall, so long as we make use of a Hydro character in our team composition, allowing us to freeze opponents. But when it comes to the stats, on your sands you want to go for attack percentage, on your goblet, cryo damage bonus, and then on your circlet, I'd recommend crit damage, as we'll already have a decent crit rate thanks to the Blizzard Straya set. As for the substats, crit rate and crit damage are king, followed by attack percentage. Now, when it comes to your talents, as we are using Chongyun as a main DPS here, I'd recommend maxing out the talents evenly in all honesty. However, if you had to choose an order, I'd still recommend going for the Spirit Blade Cloud Parting Star first, your elemental burst, followed by your normal attacks, the Demon Bane, and then finally your Spirit Blade Chonghua's Layered Frost, which is your elemental skill. This is because we're not using our elemental skill as much as the other 2 abilities. So, like I said, this build is for players who want to use Chongyun as a main DPS. At the end of the day, every character can almost fill in every role in the game, and Chongyun can still be good as a main DPS character, especially if coupled with a Hydro character, allowing for very strong Permafrost teams. Which brings us on to the third and final build, which is the support build. This build is all about providing support to a team, allowing you to turn your main DPS character into a cryo wielding character thanks to the frost field created by Chongyun, whilst also providing some attack boosts through the artifacts we're going to use. So for this build, when it comes to the weaponry, first of all I'd recommend the Sacrificial Greatsword, if not then the Luxurious Sea Lord, and then followed by the Prototype Archaic. When it comes to the artifacts, you'll want to go for 4 pieces of the Noblesse Oblige set. which will increase our elemental burst damage, but more importantly, after using an elemental burst, it will increase all party members' attack by 20% for 12 seconds. When it comes to the stats, on your sands you'll want to go for attack or energy recharge, on your goblet you'll want to go for cryo damage bonus, and then on your circlet again you want to go for crit rate or crit damage, or failing that, attack percentage. As for your talent priority, with this build I'd recommend first maxing out your elemental burst, the Spirit Blade Cloud Parting Star, followed by the Chongyun's Layered Frost, your elemental skill, and then your normal attacks. Now this build is all about supporting your team, utilising your elemental skill to infuse your main DPS's normal attacks with cryo, as well as the bonuses associated with being in the frost field, so the increase to your attack speed, as well as the potential reduction in your cooldown timers if you have the right constellation. It allows Chongyun to turn almost any sword, claymore or polearm wielding user into a cryo character. This, coupled with his quick elemental burst and the Noblesse Oblige set, means that you can activate the Noblesse Oblige attack buff quite often, allowing Chongyun to support the team in multiple ways. But overall, every character in Genshin Impact has various pros and cons. No character is perfect, unfortunately. When it comes to Chongyun, his biggest pro is that he's able to infuse his allies with cryo. So long as they're using the correct weaponry, he's able to turn almost any character into a cryo-wielding character, which allows for a lot of options when it comes to elemental reactions. On top of that, the other pro is his elemental burst. It hits hard, it's on a quick cooldown, and it has a fairly low energy cost. It means he can cast it quite quickly and quite often. And the final pro is that he can both buff and debuff opponents thanks to his passive talents. He can increase the normal attack speed of your allies, and on the opposite side of the coin, he can debuff opponents, reducing their cryo resistance. But unfortunately, every character has cons. His first con is, unfortunately, his normal attacks are relatively low, especially for a claymore user, and the final con is that unfortunately Chongyun doesn't work well with physical damage dealers who use swords, claymores or polearms, as the frost field can overwrite their physical damage, reducing their overall damage. So that's something to be aware of. But regardless, he's still a great character, and his pros definitely outweigh his cons. But every character in Genshin Impact can be made stronger thanks to team compositions. When it comes to Chongyun, he is great when it comes to elemental reaction teams. When you have a Hydro character in the team with Chongyun, you've pretty much got yourself a Permafrost team composition ready to go. So long as the Hydro character in question can keep applying Hydro within Chongyun's frost field, opponents should be frozen quite a lot of the time. Characters who can do this, such as Barbara, Mona or Kokomi, come to mind in this aspect. You can also make use of melt compositions if you wanted to as well, so long as characters can keep applying Pyro, whilst Chongyun, or the character infused with Chongyun's frost field, are attacking. Characters that come to mind like this are Jiangling or Diluc, but there is one thing you have to be aware of, and that is he doesn't work well with all characters. For example, characters who have their own infusions can't benefit from his frost field, and on top of that, he doesn't work really well when it comes to physical damage dealers if they're using swords, claymores or polearms. This is because physical damage users such as Razor don't want their physical damage overwritten by the frost field, as it will reduce their overall damage output. But overall, Chongyun is a very versatile and useful character. Whilst I personally prefer to use him as a sub DPS and support character, he can nonetheless deal damage if needed, especially when it comes to his elemental burst. On top of that, his frost field, his elemental skill, is a very useful aspect of the character, allowing you to apply cryo to anyone in your team so long as they're using a sword, claymore or polearm, which adds more options to your team. Just be mindful of who else is in your team and you'll find that Chongyun is a very enjoyable character to use. So there we have it, that is my character guide and overview of Chongyun in Genshin Impact. Now remember, there are multiple ways to play and use characters in the game, which is one of the many aspects that makes Genshin Impact so enjoyable. So at the end of the day, use the character how you want to use them. These builds are just how I personally like to use the character, but I hope they help you out in your adventures nonetheless. So until next time, I've been Darcblade, bringing you a character guide to Chongyun in Genshin Impact. Hope you enjoyed the video, thanks for watching, subscribe and like for more.